In the previous lecture, we saw Victorian realism assert strong public and moral authority through social representation and institutional critique. In this lecture, we examine what happens when that confidence comes under pressure. Rather than abandoning realism, the novel here begins to absorb darker energies that strain its ethical and social frameworks. This section explores how Gothic intensity operates within realism itself, focusing on the Brontes, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy as three distinct responses to this pressure. Even as Victorian realism presents itself as morally serious and socially intelligible, the novel increasingly registers experiences that resist harmony, reform, or ethical resolution. Alongside confidence in social narration emerges a countercurrent of emotional excess, of psychic strain, of moral anxiety that realism cannot easily absorb. This pressure doesn't reject ordinary life or recognizable settings. Instead, it intensifies them, exposing how domestic spaces, social rules, and inherited structures can generate confinement, repression, and suffering rather than stability. Victorian realism, at its strongest, contains the seeds of its own disturbance. The closer fiction comes to lived experience, the more clearly it confronts desire, frustration, and inner conflict that exceed moral explanation. Gothic elements, such as dark interiors, charged landscape, obsession, isolation, fear, appear not as supernatural spectacle, but as expressions of psychological and ethical pressure within realistic worlds. The novel remains grounded in social reality, yet that reality grows oppressive, morally ambiguous, and emotionally volatile. Gothic pressure names this internal tension, the moment when realism continues to describe ordinary life, but can no longer guarantee moral coherence or emotional containment. The Bronte sisters stand at the most intense edge of this pressure, stretching Victorian realism towards emotional extremity and psychic disturbance. Their novels don't reject social reality, but depict it as a constraining force that demands endurance, silence, and self-denial. Passion, isolation, resentment, and longing dominate inner life, and moral resolution is repeatedly deferred or denied. Social rules function less as ethical guides than as mechanisms of repression, producing characters whose emotional intensity threatens social order rather than integrate it. The Brontes don't offer reconciliation in the manner of earlier realism. They present inner life as violent, unresolved, and frequently destructive. Landscape and setting are no longer neutral environment. They are charged extensions of emotional states, reinforcing the sense that inner life overwhelms social containment. Narrative voice often aligns closely with subjective experience, minimizing distance and heightening intensity. In this way, the Brontes introduce a Gothic mode that operates inside realism itself, revealing how ordinary social worlds can generate psychic extremity rather than moral balance. George Eliot confronts the same pressures revealed by the Brontes, but responds by attempting to preserve moral intelligibility through intellectual control, sympathy, and ethical reflection. Her novels acknowledge the depth of inner life, yet resist emotional excess by placing it within a broader framework of social understanding, of historical awareness, and of moral responsibility. Eliot treats suffering not as tragic fate or explosive passion, but as the product of limited vision, mistaken judgment, and constrained circumstances. Her narrative intelligence is clear. It's a guiding voice that interprets, weighs, and contextualizes experience rather than surrendering to it. Inner conflict remains central, but it is mediated through patience and reflection rather than intensity of rebellion. Endings frequently emphasize accommodation, loss, or partial fulfillment, underscoring the difficulty of moral life without collapsing into despair. Eliot thus represents an effort to hold Gothic pressure in check, maintaining realism's ethical seriousness while acknowledging the complexity and cost of human feeling. Her work shows realism under strain, but not yet broken. With Thomas Hardy, Gothic pressure within realism reaches a decisive breaking point. Hardy's novels portray a world in which moral intention is consistently defeated by social convention, historical change, by chance, by impersonal forces. Unlike earlier Victorian fiction, suffering doesn't reliably lead to insight or reconciliation or even ethical growth. Hardy's writing is pessimistic. His characters act with sincerity and moral seriousness, yet their efforts are rendered futile by timing, circumstance, and inherited structures beyond their control. Social order remains visible and intelligible, but it appears hostile rather than sustaining. Fate replaces moral development as the dominant narrative logic. Realism here doesn't console or instruct. It exposes the fragility of human agency within an indifferent world. Hardy does not abandon ordinary life or recognizable social settings, but he drains them of ethical assurance. In doing so, he marks the point at which Victorian realism can no longer sustain its earlier moral confidence. Gothic pressure, once contained or mediated, becomes structural and unavoidable, preparing the ground for the formal and philosophical transformation that will follow. These writers, the Bronte, Eliot, and Hardy, don't represent a chronological sequence so much as three structural responses to the same problem: how realism can contain inner life once moral confidence weakens. The Brontes push emotional intensity to the foreground, allowing passion and isolation to rupture social coherence from within. Eliot responds by slowing narrative time and reasserting ethical mediation, attempting to preserve moral intelligibility through sympathy, reflection, and judgment. Hardy, by contrast, abandons the hope that either passion or ethical understanding can reconcile individuals to their world, exposing the limits of moral agency under impersonal, social, and historical forces. All three remain committed to ordinary life, to recognizable settings, and to social reality. Yet each reveals a different fault line within Victorian realism itself. They show that Gothic pressure is not an external genre influence, but an internal consequence of realism's effort to take lived experience seriously. The Victorian novel, at this point, no longer moves confidently toward harmony, but remains suspended between emotional excess, ethical mediation, and fatalistic recognition, a condition that makes further transformation inevitable. As we conclude the 19th century with this phase, we see how Victorian realism comes under internal pressure rather than external challenge. Through the Brontes, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy, the novel confronts experiences that strain social mediation, moral coherence, and narrative reassurance. Emotional extremity, ethical reflection, and fatalistic recognition emerge as competing responses to the same structural problem: how to represent inner life once realism can no longer promise harmony between individual desire and social order. The Gothic, in this sense, functions not as a separate genre, but as a pressure within realism itself, exposing its limits from inside. By the end of this phase, the novel remains formally realistic but ethically unsettled, poised for the further transformation that will follow in the move toward modern narrative forms. For more information, refer to the text shown on the screen.